Hello, Manchester. This is Jon Hopwood, and welcome once again to Ward 13. Right now, I'm waiting for a call from Dave Colapinto of the National Whistleblower Center. We're going to talk about the FBI lab corruption. It was quite a story about 14 years ago, but when 9/11 came, it kind of wiped it off the map as the FBI, their amendments was no longer a subject that society wanted to deal with. Who we were going to talk about is a special agent, Michael P. Malone. Michael P. Malone was a member of the FBI crime lab, and he was notorious for manufacturing evidence. And his testimony that was corrupt goes way back to even the McDonald trial, the famous trial of the Green Beret that allegedly killed his wife and children. This seems like it's Dave right now. Let me take the call. Hello. Is that you, Dave?
Hello?
Dave?
Yes.
Hello. Welcome to Ward 13. You're a returning guest, aren't you?
Yes. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing fine. I have my primaries coming up on Tuesday, Dave.
Oh, that should be very interesting up there.
Oh, yeah. I'm looking forward to getting elected as state rep, so the next time I see you, I can ask you that. The one question every politician asks his supporters: what have you done for me lately?
Isn't that the question your constituents would be asking you?
Dave, you're putting the cart before the horse. I have to be elected
Well, good
first.
luck to you on that.
Dave, I was just talking a brief introduction about Michael P. Malone. Who is Michael P. Malone?
Michael Malone is a former FBI forensic examiner at the FBI lab, and his area of specialty was hair and fibers analysis. He did a lot of high-profile cases, including the Jeffrey McDonald case,
The
which
Fatal
a lot of
Vision.
people know about. But whenever the FBI was called in to analyze hair and fibers in the 1980s and 90s, Michael Malone was usually involved in the case. There were other hair examiners as well, but that was his specialty, and he testified in thousands of high-profile cases, including many capital cases, a lot of murders, a lot of rape, sexual assault type cases.
Didn't he? Did he?
There was evidence of a hair from the crime scene, which then he would then go into court and say it matched
Now, Dave,
the hair from the defendant.
Dave, going back to the Fatal Vision case, Jeffrey McDonald, was he the one that provided the testimony that the hair or the fiber? Remember, there was allegedly the woman with the wig, and
Right.
he testified. He damned Jeffrey McDonald with his testimony.
That's correct, and that has been, in fact, I think another appeal was just recently filed challenging Malone because a recent report came out from the Inspector General of the Justice Department, which is a very eye-popping report. All of these allegations stem from a client of mine, Dr. Frederick Whitehurst, who was another lab chemist at the FBI lab in the 1990s.
John,
He blew the whistle on misconduct at the lab, and one of the examiners that was the subject of Whitehurst's allegations was Michael Malone.
John, can we get the picture of Fred Whitehurst? There, we have a picture of Fred. Tell us about Fred Whitehurst. From what I understand, he's a true American hero, but that he did not get treated very well by the FBI, did he not?
No, he was really the first modern whistleblower at the FBI.
There'd never been a
He
whistleblower
came forward
before?
he's a PhD chemist. He was an agent, He's a U.S. war veteran from Vietnam, and he was a very stand-up guy, and he was recruited into the FBI lab because he had particular expertise in chemistry.
Let me interrupt you for a second.
He had first-rate credentials from Duke University, etc.
Yeah.
And when he got to the lab, he was very concerned about what he saw there, about sloppy practices, contamination of evidence, etc. And as he dug deeper, he began to question whether other lab examiners were slanting evidence deliberately in order to help prosecution in cases.
Dave, let me interrupt you for just a second. What is the difference between Dr. Whitehurst, who is a PhD in chemistry, and Malone? And what was Frank Malone's background? Did he have any credentials? Why was he working in the FBI lab?
I forget what his degree was in, but that was one of the problems in the lab, was that as a result of Whitehurst's allegations, the Justice Department promised to come in and review all of the cases done by these examiners whose work was questioned, and it included Malone and 12 other examiners. And when they promised to look at all of the cases, and they set up a separate task force to do that. As a result of Whitehurst's allegations, the Inspector General found that there were severe deficiencies in the lab. The lab was not accredited. It didn't have published protocols. It did have sloppy scientific practices. It validated most of Whitehurst's allegations. And with respect to whether or not cases had been impacted by these problems, that was left to another committee or task force within the Justice Department, set up by Janet Reno, the Attorney General in the Clinton administration.
So this goes back to the 90s.
In 1996, the Justice Department promised they would look into each and every case to determine whether or not there were problems with the forensic evidence presented in those cases, and determine whether or not there was, it impacted the convictions. If it did, under Supreme Court case law, that information would have to be disclosed to the defendants in each case.
Okay, Dave, now what is that Supreme Court case, and what is the ongoing impact of it? Because recently, I got some bittersweet news the day I found out that somebody called me from Washington to tell me that I was the sole person journalist that revealed that Michael Malone had actually been working for the FBI after he supposedly had been retired or cashiered, that this discredited FBI agent was still being used at the FBI. It's the same day that I found out from Yahoo that I was being terminated, and my article was published on the Yahoo. But what is the case, and what's the ongoing ramifications? And why is it that no one but myself knew that Michael Malone was still working with the FBI after he had been discredited for over a decade, hadn't he?
Yeah, and what the case is Brady versus Maryland. It's a famous Supreme Court case. It requires the prosecution to turn over to the defense information that could tend to prove the innocence of someone or exonerate someone.
But it requires them. That's a constitutional mandate that if they have evidence that would exonerate someone, they were required to turn it over. And in the case of Donald Eugene Gates, who was convicted by Malone's evidence and testimony, because Malone just didn't manufacture evidence. He was also expert at manufacturing testimony for prosecutors, was he not?
That's right, and he was a very popular witness with prosecutors, particularly in the state of Florida, where there were a lot of death penalty cases. A lot of people are still sitting on death row. So the Justice Department had to set up a team of lawyers to look into these cases, and then what they decided, probably most of these cases were state prosecutions, state crimes.
Oh, so Brady didn't apply.
Well, Brady applies across the board. covered through the 14th Amendment.
Oh, through the 14th Amendment.
Just because it's a state prosecution doesn't mean under constitutional law it applies.
Okay.
So these were cases that were particularly difficult cases that were perhaps a high-profile murder case in states where they would rely upon the FBI lab to come in and give them the expertise in the hair evidence and other things. So
why the
FBI?
Set
up a team of lawyers to look into this, and then the job was to send the information to the original prosecutors in the case to determine whether or not the problems with the scientific evidence was material to the conviction.
Right.
And in most of those cases, the prosecutors determined that they were not going to make a disclosure to the defense.
These are the state prosecutors.
And then nothing happened.
Yes.
The entire matter got swept. A couple people got notified. Most cases, they looked at thousands of cases, and most defendants were not notified. And then, the task force in the Bush administration went out of existence with no fanfare, no publication or report to Congress as to what the task force had found or didn't find.
This is the Brady task force.
Died.
Because with the Brady cases, in Donald Eugene Gates, he spent 27 years in prison, and they had already known that there was tainted evidence for many years.
Well, that's right. His case was one of the cases that was on the list to be reviewed, and it was never disclosed to the defense or defense counsel for many, many years, and it was only by happenstance many years later that Mr. Gates, who had been convicted of, I believe, rape.
A rape murder that he did not commit.
A rape murder in Washington, D.C., and he'd always maintained his innocence, and his defense lawyer was retiring, and he had gotten a notification that Gates's case would be reviewed. This was in the late 1990s. And
1990s.
Then, almost 10 years later, when this lawyer was retiring from the practice of law, he was closing up his files, saw that nothing had ever happened after that, and so he wrote a letter to the presiding judge in the case asking that new counsel from the Public Defender Service here in D.C. be appointed. And when that occurred, it turned out that the Justice Department had done a scientific review but never given it to the defense.
How common is that?
When the judge found that out, he entertained a motion from the defense to see whether or not there was still in existence the original hair evidence from the case and to have it tested with DNA testing, which was not available in the early 1980s. And it turned out, after the testing was conducted, that the hair did not belong to Mr. Gates, and that he was, in fact, innocent after spending 20-plus years in prison.
Now, Dave,
25 years or whatever.
Dave, I got
So that was one case. It has now turned out that there are 6 cases in the District of Columbia alone where people have been found to be innocent after DNA testing has been done on evidence
provided by
most of the cases were handled by Michael Malone. Some of them were not. So it wasn't just Malone. It's easy to say, it was just one bad apple. It wasn't just one bad apple. There were, severe flaws in the FBI lab, particularly with this type of evidence.
Hey, Dave, So
what happened was we decided, Dr. Whitehurst and I decided to file a Freedom of Information Act request to find out what had ever happened to the Brady task force.
That was investigating the fact that the federal prosecutors had not turned over the evidence that could exonerate defendants.
Right. It took us 8 years to get the files under FOIA. We submitted our FOIA request in 2003. In 2011, we finally had gotten the last release of the files, and at that point, we worked with the Washington Post to review the files and to do some public searches to see whether or not people had been contacted. And the Post did some good reporting on that and ran a 4-part series and broke the story that the Justice Department had failed to contact the defense lawyers in multiple cases where they had found problems with the scientific evidence. That was in 2012. Right. That led to a promise by the Justice Department and the FBI that they would review all the hair analysis cases.
They promised, but did they follow through?
Well, we found out about a month and a half ago, there was another front page story in the Washington Post which revealed that although they had promised in 2012 to review about 20,000 hair analysis cases that the FBI had handled, when the FBI started looking at them, because they found problems in virtually every case they looked at,
every case,
the FBI put a halt to that review and just decided we're not going to do it.
Dave, how many people might be on death row from manufactured or tainted evidence from the FBI lab?
Well,
do you have any idea?
This summer there was an Inspector General's report.
The IG report.
Published the cases that they found, and this is just a snapshot. We think there are a lot more cases, but they found that as part of this review, the original review, going back to 1996, there were in excess of 400 cases out of, they looked at about 3,000 cases, and about 400 cases they found scientific problems with the evidence.
Jeez.
So then, of those 400 cases, there were about 64 cases of people on death row. And Mr. Malone had testified in about half of those cases.
So this is like almost a doctored death of the FBI lab. But let's get...
Since this review has been going on and never been completed, about several people have been executed without having their cases reviewed.
My God.
So there may be, in fact, innocent people who have been executed already. There's likely that there are people sitting on death row who are not guilty, who have been convicted based on this evidence, but we don't know the answer to these questions because for 18 years the Justice Department refused to complete this review and to notify defendants and to bring these issues forward in the courts.
Dave, we're getting limited time. We're only a half hour, and you're a well-paid mouthpiece, I know. So I'm just going to get to Whitehurst. Getting back to Malone, Whitehurst had charged that Malone and other FBI crime lab employees were not only manufacturing evidence to support prosecutors, but were engaged in providing perjured trial testimony.
Yeah, that's right. And
he
the
had
Justice Department Inspector General refused to go along with the perjury allegation, but they did find that false testimony was presented in court by these examiners.
In 1997.
Repeatedly. And, what happened in those cases, with those examiners, most of them retired without ever being disciplined by the FBI.
What about
even
Malone?
After those findings were made. And then, in the case of Malone,
yes.
He retired.
What year did he retire?
The Justice Department looked at it, the managers looked at it, and they said, well, this is a stale case. We really can't discipline this guy. He's now retired, et cetera. So he retired around 1999.
Well, Dave, the 1990...
We have just found out recently, confirmed that he went back to work for the FBI.
But Dave,
the Justice Department claims they just found out about this in May of this year. Mr. Malone went back to work for the FBI as a contractor to do security clearance background checks for the FBI. Working for an FBI contractor, and he went back to work like around 2002. And we had heard about this, and the only person that I know of who published that information was you back in 2009. You had published an article in Yahoo, reporting that information. That was publicly available.
Why didn't anybody else
pick it up? It now turned out to be true. I mean, it's confirmed, and it wasn't until this spring when the IG claimed they first learned about it. Why they didn't check the internet and find your story, I don't know. But when they looked at it, they went to the FBI and they finally terminated Malone's relationship with the FBI.
So it was a 1997 report from the DOJ IG validated what Whitehurst had been said about Malone and cited Malone as one of 14 FBI crime lab employees that conducted inaccurate tests and made false reports. Now, it was Fred Whitehurst who was retaliated against, was it not? And Malone not only got a pass, he got to retire, but then was brought back. Dave, what does this say about the corporate culture of the FBI lab, and the Inspector General? It just doesn't seem to be able, they don't seem to be able to clean house, do they?
They will not fix this problem unless there is outside oversight and publicity. It will never happen. And the tragedy here is that there are now documented cases, at least 6 in the District of Columbia, and I think that there are going to be many, many more nationwide. When you just do the statistically, there have to be more innocent people out of these thousands of cases that have been impacted. That there were so many problems that the crime here is that they sat on this evidence for 18 years and didn't bother to look. They didn't care that people had been wrongly convicted.
Dave, I got another question. Why would the state of Florida go to the FBI? Don't they have their own crime lab? And my spin on it, do state prosecutors look to the FBI lab for evidence, manufactured evidence, and perjured testimony in order to get convictions? Is that what this is about? Is that why somebody like Malone was able to continue to work for the FBI for 17 years after the whistle was blown on him?
Well, the FBI held themselves out as the world's premier crime lab.
Yes.
So if you were a prosecutor in a state and you had a high-profile case, you'd want to bring in somebody like that to impress the jury. And Mr. Malone was very impressive in front of a jury. And he exceeded all the bounds of acceptability. He would say that things were an exact match, even after the FBI had itself condemned that practice. Yet he continued to be allowed to testify in case after case, saying that this hair matches this hair from the crime scene. This hair from the defendant matches the crime scene hair. And you cannot make that statement, yet that's what prosecutors brought these guys in to do, and it was very effective in convicting people.
What is the chance of the people that Malone has convicted with his perjured testimony and his manufactured evidence? What are the chances of these people getting justice?
Well, unless there is public exposure to this, unless people continue to fight to have these documents released to the defendants, so that the courts can get involved and test, it's going to be very, very difficult. And time is the enemy here. The crime that they waited 18 years. Every day that goes by risks destruction of evidence.
Right. Well, Dave,
so the odds are some people who are wrongly convicted will never get out.
So they're condemned by this man. And can you just...
it's not just one man.
It's 13.
There was a system in place. There was more than Malone doing this.
The FBI culture. But he is like the symbol of the corruption of the FBI lab and the FBI culture. Is he not?
That's right. And, it's like, there are... In the state of Mississippi, they had to stay an execution earlier this year because it was one of the cases impacted. The man was hours away from being executed, and the courts finally put a halt to that so that further testing could be done on this type of evidence.
Okay, Dave, we have to wrap it up now. I have one final thing. In the Lockerbie bombing, there was the English papers actually wrote about how that case was withdrawn, and the defendant there was allowed to go to Libya because the FBI, surprisingly, had shown up at the Lockerbie and had provided tainted evidence to Scotland Yard. That's a story that was not covered in the United States. But thank you.
That's correct, and that's another case that Whitehurst blew the whistle on.
I'd like to have Fred Whitehurst on the show because this is a genuine American hero. But we got to wrap up now, my friend. Thank you so much for calling. And hey, when are you going to get me some? Am I going to be able to see the playoffs with the Nats? I bring them good luck.
Well, we'll see. When are the Red Sox going to the World Series again?
2015. Okay, Dave. Have a good day.
All right. Talk to you later.
Okay. Bye. Well, thank you very much, Manchester, for visiting me once again in Ward 13. Have a good night and a pleasant week. Thank you.